The transfer portal is open, and OTTTOGO Jaydn Ott does indeed apparently have to go, and he has. This is the College Game Day podcast. We are recording on Wednesday, April 16th, a little over a week before the NFL draft, but there are plenty of pressing issues in college football with the 10-day or so period that the transfer portal will be open, and dominating the headlines over the last several days has been the entire situation surrounding now former, erstwhile, if you will, Tennessee quarterback Nico Iamaleava, who sat out of practice trying to renegotiate his NIL deal and subsequently was sent on his way by Josh Heupel and the Volunteers. It's elicited a lot of reaction across the sport. We're going to talk to Tom Luginbill and to Heather Dinich about that in a matter of moments. And another transfer portal piece of news: Jaydn Ott, the Cal star, the subject of the great song that has been embedded in my brain for months, is now going to Oklahoma. So I have to work on some new lyrics for this because part of the OTTTOGO song included things like fastest in the ACC. Well, that's not going to work anymore. You don't want to just rip off the lyrics and change it to fastest in the SEC. So maybe it goes something like OTTTOGO Jaydn Ott is ought to go. Grab the bag and hit the door. Jaydn Ott, to OU he goes. Something like that. Anyway, we'll work on it and get it better and better. But joking and parody lyrics aside, this is a big pickup for Oklahoma to go along with John Mateer, the quarterback from Washington State, who is there with his offensive coordinator, Ben Arbuckle. And perhaps it will give people even more optimism about what is to come for Oklahoma in this upcoming season. But we want to start with the big news because we really haven't discussed it on this podcast yet, of Nico Iamaleava. There are a lot of different ways to look at this, and the first way that I look at it is this. If you've listened to this podcast or heard me on Game Day for years, you know that I'm all for the players getting paid. I also believe that the players have not gotten their due for years. We're going to see some of this resolved if and when, and assumingly it'll be when, the House settlement gets approved. But there's a way to conduct business and there's a way not to conduct business. And in my judgment, Nico Iamaleava and his representatives, which include his father and other agents, handled this as ham-handedly and as poorly as you can possibly imagine. They didn't have the leverage that they thought they had. They didn't have a landing spot, which you need to have a landing spot before you go in and start demanding extra money. And the other thing is that they came off as extraordinarily ungrateful in all of this, which is also a damage to your reputation. Nico Iamaleava, for those of you who might not know, was first approached while he was still in high school, and Tennessee came with an NIL deal, all within the rules, and then subsequently in court, the Tennessee State Attorney, I believe, Attorney General, I think I have that right, fought on his behalf to make sure the NCAA couldn't say that he was ineligible to play for Tennessee. And he collected some money up front. He collected some money in the year that he did not play. And then he had moments last season, but he didn't have a great season by any stretch of the imagination, although he was certainly good and he had some big moments. He was a guy who was wildly talented, still growing, and you felt as if unlimited potential if he stayed on course. Yet it has become apparent that there were other factors at play, and Nico either was not interested or did not quite have the internal strength to stand up to his circle and say, this is not the way we're going to do business. And as a result, he skipped out on a practice, and that was the end of the road for him with the Volunteers. What's next for Nico? Well, I think it's a very limited market. Not a lot of people have the money, room, or inclination to risk their own quarterback room on him. And, there are a lot of unanswered questions. He'll play. He's talented enough to play great, and I'm sure that he can come back from this. There's no doubt about it, but it is certainly a significant bump in the road. For much more on on this from a guy who has some unique perspective on how things work in recruiting, how this particular situation has played out, and certainly because he is a terrific analyst for us, comes from a coaching family, has been embedded in the recruiting world for years and years. We're happy to be joined by Tom Luginbill. Tom, the entire Nico Iamaleava saga sort of hit a nerve with everybody either way. I'm of the opinion I don't mind what Nico gets. I'm all for him commanding whatever money he can, but I think this was ham-handed in the way it was handled, and I think a lot of it is certainly on his reps and on his dad to some degree, but it's also on him because they represent him, and he's old enough to know not to skip practice, not to just not to no show and all of that. Where do you land on all of this?
Listen, there's plenty of blame to go around, Rece. And to be honest with you, in my experience from a recruiting perspective, you could see this coming back when the young man was 16, 17 years old, because you could see throughout the recruiting process that this is what they were seeking. What was going to be the greatest deal? How could name, image, and likeness help me not only now, but in the future? Which ended up going into a court case with Tennessee because, as we all know, this was never intended to be applied to the high school ranks. And so you could see that this was inevitable, not just with Nico, but this was going to happen when you have the wild, wild west as we have it, and you have an open market, and you decide to play your hand, you overplay it, and you overestimate your value, particularly off of the level of production that you displayed to this point, Rece. And so I think initially Tennessee went into this and they knew the risks. And recruiting is all about weighing risk, right? Are you willing to hope for a better result, minimize the downside, and hopefully things work out? It doesn't always work out. This time it got Tennessee, but I credit them for digging their heels in and saying, guys, enough is enough. This is the deal we signed. This is where you're at. You didn't have terrific production as a redshirt freshman in the SEC. Let's continue to develop and move forward. You're earning an unbelievable wage, generational wealth if you do it the right way. And they overplayed their hand. And now, Rece, we're going to find the ugly downside to the name, image, and likeness open capitalistic market, right? When it doesn't go your way from a player perspective.
Here's the other question, Tom. I think there's a possibility, too, that he could go at a discounted rate someplace, hit the portal again, and get a payday if he plays well. If he's not ready to go to the NFL at that point. Where does your gut tell you he winds up this year?
UCLA. I just feel like that one makes the most sense. It would be an opportunity for them to make a splash. Deshaun Foster finished the season last year really, really strong. However, they're still in rebuilding mode. The top receiver, top running back, tight end, all went into the transfer portal. Schlesinger, the linebacker, is gone. Their best offensive lineman was a walk-on a year ago. He jumps into the transfer portal. So there's a lot of work to be done, and what a way to be able to potentially fix it by bringing in a talented quarterback.
And new offensive coordinator there who's had some success, Tino Sinceri, who was, along with Mike Shanahan, worked for Kurt Cignetti at Indiana last year. So a new era of offense there. Tommy, great job as always. Great to see you, and have a great portal season now that the portal is officially open.
Oh, I'm certainly enjoying it. Nico made my last Saturday a lot of fun.
We are joined now by the great Heather Dinich, fresh off wowing New York advertising crowd in the new Disney ESPN studios in New York City. Heather, well done there for sure. I'm sure you generated a lot of revenue for ESPN. They're letting them know that what a hot property college football is. And on that subject right now, how to divide the spoils, the House settlement, getting it approved, spending money up front on rosters, all of this stuff. I've noticed that you've pointed out, and I think you're right on this, fans are over it. They don't care. They might want to throw up their hands in disgust and frustration from time to time. But at the end of the day, we're back to the whole Seinfeld thing. The fans are saying, I'm for this laundry. I like who's going to wear the jersey that I like best. I'm for them. It's okay. And is that where you are on all of this right now? I know there's a bigger industrial thing to talk about, and that's important, and it's our jobs to do so. But from a fan perspective, they've had enough, right?
they've had enough. And it's exhausting, I think, to just constantly be hearing about the NCAA House settlement and NIL because it's so in the weeds, right? It's inside baseball. And at the end of the day, college football fans want to know, who is my starting quarterback? How many teams are in the college football playoff? How do they qualify for it? And is my team going to be one of them? And you and I both know the excitement around college football on Labor Day is through the roof that opening weekend. And there's nothing like it. It's unparalleled in college athletic. And I don't say that to belittle or demean any other sport or the very real conversations that are going on around college athletics, because as you said, they're important. We need to cover it. But I also just don't like the doom and gloom that's around college athletics, because I do believe the NCAA House settlement is a step in the right direction. And I do believe that leaders in college athletics, from the athletic directors to sport administrators and the commissioners, care about Olympic sports. And as long as it does not get to the point where players are considered employees, I think Olympic sports will be okay, because if they are considered employees at some point, that's where the budget breaks. That's where athletic departments say, we can't afford to pay you and we can't afford to treat sports like this. That's where it really crosses the line, I think.
And Heather, I think that's the only answer. I think because it's such a big business. I've been against for years players being employees, because I said for a long time, and perhaps erroneously so, that the universities were so ill-equipped to sometimes run their own athletic departments. Not that the athletic directors don't do a good job. I don't mean that, but just from a whole legal employee negotiations union, they were ill-equipped to do so, and therefore it wasn't a good idea. I now believe it's really the only answer, because you have to have some type of parameters. And I don't like the word guardrails, because that implies that everybody's, including the players, are somehow out of control trying to get money, when they're just getting in the business of exercising their rights in the market of competitive commerce. And there's nothing wrong with that. So what we need is just what every other business has, is a framework. And when you have that, you have employers and employees. At the end of the day, it's what they are. Right now, when you're making millions, when you're paying or trying to pay a quarterback $2.4 million, and he says no, that's an employee-employer relationship. That's what it is. And so I don't know any other thing. I had an athletic director call me the other day to talk about the notion of sort of showing Congress some good faith by making some of these things happen through the college football playoff and showing that they could revenue share there, and then as a result, perhaps getting some type of legislative relief in this. But I think you're absolutely right. It's all in the weeds. The other sports are worth protecting, and I sort of fall on the side that they can protect all of them they want to. They're capable of doing it. And at least that's the way I look at it.
Well, and the commissioners and everyone below them certainly gets paid enough money to figure it out. Let's not pretend that they don't, right?
Yep.
And the other point about them becoming employees, while we're talking about employee type money and deals and agents and things like that, what people forget, and this is something the commissioners have talked about, is, do you really want to fire your quarterback for his completion percentage and the taxes that come along with it? If people forget about when you're 18 years old and you're actually an employee and filing taxes and time off. And, one of the commissioners, I think it was Jim Phillips in the ACC, talked about on Capitol Hill recently. No, it was Tony Petitti in the Big Ten. He said, if you're treating them as employees, you're starting to manage the hours and their time. And the last thing you want to do is take time away from players with their coaches, right? Because sometimes people get paid by the hour. So there's a lot of nitty gritty that maybe you really don't want to get into when you're stuck to talk about employee contracts.
But Heather, you and I both know that the 20-hour rule is a farce. I mean, that's not a real thing anyway. And people who have big contracts like this, they don't really limit their hours. They do the work that is necessary to be done. And I feel like here's how I feel about it. Like, let's talk about, we'll use Nico Iamaleava as an example here. I've seen a lot of people say, well, this is dad's to blame. His representatives are to blame. And that's probably true to a degree. So's Nico. Because when you employ an agent, that agent is you. And if your agent does something outside of what you want him to do, then you go to the person they're negotiating with and say, that was a mistake on his part. And you either fire him, reprimand him or her, and say, well, this is not how we're going to do business, right? Nico's being paid the money. He didn't do this. So this is on him too. And it's also, look, it's his right. I'm okay with him doing it. I don't think it's the right thing ethically or from a teammate standpoint for him to do. But from a broad perspective, do you have the right to renegotiate? Yes, you do. Do you have the right to try to employ some leverage, or even if you didn't really have the leverage you thought you did, you have the right to do this. It was an error in judgment, but you have the right. And I'm not on board with the people who are sort of absolving him of this and pointing at his dad and pointing at the other reps. Yes, he's probably getting bad advice, but it's on him too.
Well, I agree to an extent, but it pains me to see how much backlash he's taking as a, 19, 20-year-old college student for everything that's happened around this. And yes, he was at the quarterback dinner on Thursday. On Friday, he didn't show up. That's when he lost the locker room, according to sources. And there was no going back at that point, is the phrase that was told to me. It could have absolutely been handled better. He could have handled it better. But I think in the big picture here, Rece, adults are to blame, not just for this
He's
scenario.
An adult, Heather. He's an adult.
When you were 19 years old?
I don't say you're fully mature. I'm more mature at my age than I was at 19. But if you're old enough to be paid what he's being paid, if you're old enough to go to war and vote and get paid $2.4 million, I don't begrudge him one penny of it. If he could get $4 million, good for him.
Right.
But I just push back at this idea, these guys aren't adults. Yes, they are. They're not fully mature. They have growing and learning to do. Court stipulates that. This is not a child actor at 12 that somebody's having to handle everything. This is different.
That's fair. That's fair. But I will stand by my belief that I think this whole situation was created by a failure of leadership a decade ago. And then you have it exacerbated at this point. And who created his value? Was it Nico? This started when he was in high school. When he was in high school, somebody said, this is your price tag and this is what you're worth. And that's where that starts. And that's a problem in my mind. But I don't begrudge him the money either. The question, Rece, is what happens now at this point forward? Because this is happening every day. I talked to a head coach in the SEC. I was like, what's different about this? What's different is the no-show. What's different is who he is and who he's playing for, because no one's talking about the freshman left tackle at who knows where who's asking for $1.5 million every day. And I had an athletic director tell me, you know what? There were some people who were afraid players weren't going to show up at the Final Four for this very same reason, or in the NCAA tournament, because, hey, I'm not going to do this unless you pay me more money, And so the no-show, and this goes back to the employee contracts. This is what's different from the NFL, right? NFL has an employee contract, and these guys don't show up. Okay, they figure it out in terms of their contract. But these contracts with the players, to my understanding, are with the NIL collectives. Not with the school, right? So that's a little bit that's a little bit different right there. But I mean, look, here's the problem now. Let's spin it forward. The problem now is Tennessee has two quarterbacks who haven't started a collegiate game. Nico has no idea where he's going or how much money he's going to get. And to me, how this story ends impacts if we see more of this in the future. Because if he doesn't get the money, then he's a cautionary tale. And if he doesn't wind up at a great school, if he does, he could come out looking like a hero to other players who said, oh, that worked. Let me see if I'm going to do that.
I also want to point out, Tennessee's not pure as a driven snow. Right. I mean, they were aggressive when Nico was in high school. That's one thing. Nor can Tennessee afford to be pure as the driven snow because nobody is in this. And it's my understanding, allegedly, that a couple of quarterbacks have already gotten raises as a result of the fact that they're going to stay put and not go to Tennessee to replace Nico. I wish everybody well, wish Tennessee well, wish Nico well. But you bear responsibility for, any action you take. And
Sure.
That's where I stand on this. Before I let you go here, I know you've got a story to go chase. You've got some sleepers, things that are actually much more fun to talk about here. Who do you really like that might not garner all of the preseason attention of others?
So I think in the SEC, people should pay attention to Florida with DJ Lagway if he's healthy. That's a huge if. It all rides on that. And I think that, again, they have arguably one of, if not the toughest schedules in the country. So I don't think Billy Napier is completely off the hook when it comes to job security. But if that defense continues to show strides and Lagway continues to play the way he did down the stretch, that's a team that might surprise some people in the SEC. Then in the Big Ten, Rece, I like who's going to be the next Indiana? Well, maybe it's Illinois. And I like them because they've got veteran starting quarterback coming back. They've got, I want to say, all 5 starting offensive linemen back, 18 starters in total. But the biggest thing with Illinois is who they don't play. And that is Penn State, Oregon, and Michigan. Ohio State's their toughest schedule. So remember, you can get but you can get an at-large bid for the CFP. So you can get in without winning the Big Ten. And if they can at least play against Ohio State in the championship game or Penn State, they come in as runner-up, I wouldn't rule it out entirely. So those are 2.
Well, Indiana did it. You said this year's Indiana. That is precisely the formula Indiana used, with the exception of they did play Michigan, but it was a bit of a rebuilding Michigan. Yep. So they used the formula to perfection a year ago. So we'll certainly keep an eye on that. Heather, great job as always. Enjoyed seeing you in New York. That was awesome, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Back at you, my friend. Thanks so much.
Transfer portal, NIL. Players moving, skipping practice, running backs having songs named after them, and then suddenly they're off to a different school. What we need is just a little touch of the nostalgia and the old school feel of college football. And for that, we're pleased to be joined now by Dave Wilson. You've seen his stuff on ESPN.com, writes primarily about college sports, also spent some time at the Masters, and what an event that was this past weekend, a great dramatic moment in sports. But Dave, for our purposes, you just wrote an exhaustive and extensive and beautifully written piece about RC Slocum, legendary figure for Texas A&M, friend of college football, has been involved with many things for the National Football Foundation, College Football Hall of Fame, of which he is a member. Why did you want to write a piece at this stage about RC Slocum?
Well, I think exhaustive would probably be the word that my editors would choose as well, because it was a long story.
I did not mean that dismissively. No. I loved it. I thought the piece was tremendous.
I'm just joking because it was very long, but my point was, he just retired at A&M after 53 years at 80 years old. And I don't think people really realize that he was still kind of officially working there. I mean, he arrived in 1972 as a 27-year-old, retired at a vastly different A&M than he arrived at in, this year. And I just think there are guys like him in college football that we don't realize have had as much of an impact on one place. And I would argue that he's had as much impact on one place as anybody ever has at a program.
Texas A&M is a tight-knit fraternity of which you are a member, so you understand it better than anyone. How do you think the way RC Slocum is viewed now compares with how he was viewed when he was dismissed? And was it after the 2002 season? I think after the 2002 season?
Yeah, 2002 season. So I was a student there in 91 to 93. I was in the stands. I told him one time that I was one of the guys up there hollering at him to throw the ball more. And he said, "I know you are. I'm hearing your voice right now." But I think there was we took him. I think he was taken for granted for a long time because he just was always there. RC was a fixture. He was there, showed up in 72. He left for 1 year because John Robinson came and lured him for a team that was preseason #1 to come be the defensive coordinator. I mean, that's how he was regarded in the business. But to us, he was just a guy in Texas. He was just a guy we were used to having around. And I don't think we ever really gave him a proper accounting. And so you look back, every A&M coach since 1957, when Bear left for Alabama, has either been fired or forced out. No one has ever won a conference championship in 25 years since he left, or since 1998 when they beat Kansas State in the Big 12 championship game in an upset. And I just think, sometimes there are guys like him who have had an outsized impact, but no one seems to really appreciate it. And then, he had a scare with cancer a couple of years ago, and I think it kind of hit everybody that, he's not always going to be here. He just has been, but he's not always. And maybe it's time we realize everything that he's done for this place.
I had a prominent former coach in a different sport one time say to me, "You show me a coach who got fired, who says he still roots for the school that fired him, and I will show you a liar," which is a hilarious line. Yet I believe, from my time around RC Slocum at various things over the years and various boards, I think he is the exception to that rule. Why?
He has a rare perspective that none of us have. I've asked him a million times, how can you stay here? They fired you. You were easily the most consistent winner they've ever had. Jackie Sherrill obviously jolted them into relevance, kicked down the doors, made them get serious about building a program and not just throwing money at a coach, although they threw a lot of money at a lot of coaches, clearly. And then RC kind of stabilized everything and made them a winner. And he knew what A&M was. He knew, Dan Campbell tells a funny story about being recruited by John Makovic, and he wanted to go to Texas. His cousin had played for Texas, and an unnamed Texas assistant, he didn't say who it was, showed up at his door, and he lived out in the country in the middle of nowhere. And there were these Spanish goats at the ranch next door. And the Texas assistant said, "Man, I've never seen black deer before." And his dad was just like, "Oh my gosh, like, who are these people? Like, give me a break." And he said the next week, RC pulls up in his pickup and says, "Man, those are some great looking Spanish goats over there." And he just, like, Dan's dad was like, "This is our guy." And I think there's we talk about fit all the time in college football. And I think RC loved the Aggies. He did since the first time they took him there when they weren't any good. He loved them until he loves them now. He called me the other day after the story came out, and he was in the dining hall with the Corps of Cadets eating fried chicken. I mean, he's retired, but he's never going to be retired. This is who he is. And he says, "The Aggies didn't fire me. Just one or two guys fired me. Why would I leave? All my friends are here. When I go hunting, I go with Aggies. When I go fishing, I go with Aggies. When I go to football games, I sit with Aggies. Why would I want to be anywhere else?" Which is remarkable considering they fired him and they fired Sherman and Sumlin, two of his assistants. And I was like, they fired everybody. And he's like, that's what happens to coaches. And it's just a very rare perspective that I think comes with growing up the way he did.
He's a fascinating gentleman for sure. And when you have an iconic figure on a campus like that, I don't think we see as much of that. We are almost struggling in the sport right now to have the proverbial, veteran elder statesman, who has some degree of gravitas based on accomplishment. I guess, you could argue certainly Dabo Swinney, Kirby Smart, both those are relatively young guys, relatively speaking, but certainly well established and into their careers. I get the feeling that the RC Slocums of the sport are a relic of a bygone era that we're not going to see very often. I could see Dabo, whenever he decides not to coach anymore, doing that at Clemson, but I can't think of many other examples.
I think that was the point to me of the story and why it mattered now. If you imagine 53 years, when he got there, Gene Stallings had just gotten fired. And I asked Coach Stallings one time why it was such a hard job. And he said, "Dave, have you ever tried to recruit a football player to an all-male military school during Vietnam? It ain't easy." And so when RC got there in 72, they had 14,000 students. Only 1,700 were women. There were almost no black students. there was, College Station itself was really no different than Manhattan, Kansas, or Ames, Iowa. It's a rural farm town. It was an ag school. And so I think when you look at A&M today, they have, more money than God. They got all the, facilities they want. He didn't have any of that. He started that. They decided they wanted to build facilities, and they went on a tour of the country to try to see what they wanted to do. And they went to Florida and saw the swamp and decided, oh, we'll build an end zone facility like that. And then they didn't include a locker room or anything in there. So he had to go get the money from Bum Bright, the former Cowboys owner, to get the locker room built. He drove to Dallas and got a check himself. And then he got fired and he never got to go in there. And so I think that, to me, is what's remarkable about him. He's a guy that truly understands what they need. And if it wasn't for him, he would have wanted somebody else to have it anyway. And in the years since, you talk to him about Jimbo and you talk to him about the buyout, and he's like, well, it's hard to do because, the legislature and the money, and you don't want it to look bad. And he's almost embarrassed by that stuff, but he gets that in a way that nobody else does, because he literally was almost an administrator of his own program at the time.
You talked about the differences and the difficulties in the past, and it called to mind a story in preparation for the NFL draft next week. Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M is going to be, a high draft pick. And when he was being recruited from the Miami area, his family didn't want him to go to Miami because they were worried about the distractions and the lifestyle. And he chose College Station. And whether you view this to be a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure is there anything more polar opposite for Miami than College Station. Yet it is modernized now. And I had an administrator say to me not long ago, is like, they lead the world, as you alluded to earlier, in throwing money at problems.
Yes.
RC Slocum, last guy to win a conference championship. We've seen other places be able to, maybe in a more structured way, but they throw money at problems and had been wildly successful. Oregon leaps to mind.
Right.
When you and I were younger and in school, Oregon wasn't a force. At all. They were an afterthought. Dan Fouts played there. Things like that. Maybe there was a moment. Ahmad Rashad, Bobby Moore played there, and that was kind of it. Now they're nouveau riche, as it were, in college football. They're an it program. They're a contender every year. Some of the things you mentioned that Gene Stallings had to deal with are long since over. There are many other things that A&M has going for it in terms of the population of the campus. The undergraduate population is huge.
Massive.
There is no fan base that is more loyal to the school than Aggies are to Texas A&M. So why haven't they been able to win consistently?
I think it's been a matter of, when Kevin Sumlin got there, he really was the first guy since RC really to land, top like Myles Garrett level recruits. And so, but there were one or two of those guys. RC was on the level of recruiting against Texas. But Texas got its act together and Mac Brown straightened it out. Bob Stoops straightened out Oklahoma. The timing lined up rough for them. They were their best when Texas and Oklahoma were down. Then the Mid-Southwest Conference imploded. The Big 12 started. Stoops comes in. Mac Brown comes in. Mike Leach comes in. It really shook everything up. And he was just getting it together. Had just hired Sumlin as offensive coordinator. And I think there's always been a timing. There's close. If you look at that 2012 team, no one would have wanted to play Johnny Manziel in that offense at the end of the year if there was a playoff that year. But that's all would have, could have, should have, kind of stuff. I think the answer is that part of it is fit. And I always thought it was interesting with the Jimbo philosophy of recruiting nationally and going for the biggest names, the biggest players, because I just don't know how much they care if you win or lose if you're in College Station. I think there's 25 kids that bleed maroon that want to win there. And those guys, you need some of those guys. I asked Gary Patterson one time why he was 8-2 against Texas, and he said, because I recruit football players and they recruit stars. And I think there's something to that. There's guys that want to be there and want to win and really care. And there's other guys that just want the check to clear. And I think there's a combination of those things. The coach lining up with the players, lining up with the era of football. I mean, so I think there's an opportunity now. Nick Saban's gone. I mean, obviously Kirby is who he is, but they're trying to build it the way they did. They hired a defensive coach for the first time since RC, who's a little bit more of a low profile guy and more of a grinder. They realized that they've got to get their act together in a bunch of ways. So I think that's always been the question. Why can't they? And I think that they are still trying to figure that out, as we all are.
So Mike Elko, grinder, defensive guy, not a Texas guy.
No.
East Coast guy. One of the reasons Duke hired him was because when he came in and did his interview, he had a complete plan of how he would recruit at Duke and use the I-95 corridor. He had the relationships that he had with some of the prep schools and different things that could get players in more easily to Duke. He had a real East Coast feel, and that was very attractive to them. Now, I know he was DC at Texas A&M, and he understands that. I believe that to be a great hire at A&M. So I'm going to ask you a difficult question, maybe based on hearsay, and you might not be willing to answer, which a good interviewer, which I'm not being right now, never gives you an out. So don't do that in the future, and I know you won't. How does RC feel about Mike Elko? RC Slocum, kind of country guy, Texas guy. Mike Elko, grinder, tough, hard-nosed, terrific coach, East Coast guy. Does it even matter anymore?
At Mike Elko's introductory press conference, he spoke. The first thing he did when he walked off the stage was walked up to RC Slocum and said, "Thank you for everything." I think that was important. I think there has been a tension there. RC won't tell you that. But, there is a little distance. There was a distance with Jimbo and the high school coaches. They didn't like him. He didn't care about them. He went through the NIL guys and the recruiters and the 7-on-7 guys a lot of times. He didn't come to the coaching's convention. He was the only coach in the state that didn't come to the high school coaches convention the last year he was there. Those kind of things. And Mike Elko, the first thing he did when he came in, he thanks RC. He goes to the high school coaches regional meeting and tells them they're the most important part of this program. He's trying to rewire the place. And I think that's important. And I think that's what RC appreciates is you have a guy who understands the gravity of the job. He's not above it. He knows it's a hard work job. It's a blue collar place. And I think the fit, like we said, the fit matters. You're talking about Dan Campbell and Aaron Glenn and all these guys going on to be head coaches 23 years after RC last coached. Those are those guys. And Mike Elko is one of those guys. So I think he's not the glitz and glamour that a lot of A&M fans, I think, wanted for a big name, but I think he fits what they're doing.
What have you got as a prediction for the Aggies this year?
I don't want, Coach Elko got mad about it, but it's the standard at this point in time is to just say 8-4 and anything else is an improvement because that's kind of what the Aggies have been for the last decade. If they're lucky, I mean, obviously the App State loss and that terrible season notwithstanding, but I think I don't know, honestly. I mean, I'm going to tell you, I'm more of a storyteller than a analyst. You guys are great at that, but I would say I think there's potential. They're rebuilding around the offensive line, which had struggled so badly. And they got all those guys coming back. A lot of those guys coming back. They've got running backs coming back that were injured. Marcel Reed has a year in the offense after finally being the starter. So, maybe it's the old former student in me, but there's a little optimism over here.
Dave, tremendous job on the piece. Really enjoyed reading, and thanks for spending some time with us today. And I should have greeted you by saying howdy. So instead, I'll just say gig 'em.
That's all right. I appreciate it, Rece. Thanks for having me.
Great to have Dave Wilson on with us today. He's got a million stories. We should have gotten into some more RC Slocum stories, some more Aggie stories, maybe Mike Elko gets the Aggies going. Dave can join us again and give us a little more insight and a few more walks down memory lane, sort of remind us that this entire sport is not just built on NIL and transactions and putting together the best fantasy rosters so that fans can say, I'm rooting for that piece of laundry. There's a little bit of a piece of people's souls that are still evident in many of these programs. And we want to celebrate that, recognize and put spotlight on it as often as we can, because that's why we grew up loving this sport. It is certainly, we all want our teams to win, but we also want the sport to flourish as well. And part of that, to me, is making sure that we hold on to some of these nostalgic things that are such a part of the DNA and the fabric of the sport. Thanks for listening to the College Game Day podcast. We encourage you to download this wherever you prefer to get your podcast. You can subscribe and never miss a single episode. And of course, the NFL Draft is coming up next week. We are deep in preparation for that and look forward to getting you all the information you need on that, and hopefully even talking to you on the eve of starting the draft from Green Bay. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.